funny that some weeks seem long and other weeks seem really short? You know, like some weeks seem like they fly right by and other weeks seem like they last forever. Even though all weeks are only 7 days, they're all the same length of time, but some just feel so fast and some feel so long. For you, this last week, who felt like this last week it just flew right by? It was fast, you blinked and disappeared, right? How many of you thought it dragged on and on? You thought it would never end? Yes. Isn't that funny? And we all lived the exact same week. No difference. Jesus' last week on earth is a famous week, and we call it Holy Week. And we'll be celebrating that and remembering a lot about it in 2 weeks from now. But that week, for Jesus, I have a feeling it was one of those weeks that just dragged on and on. And for sure, Jesus was busy. There was a lot going on. Every day was packed with things, from what we know. But it was a hard week. It was a tough week. I mean, it was an exhausting week. It was painful. And the things he was doing and experiencing and dealing with, they were tough. And that's the kind of week that just drags on and on. To give a little context, just in advance, because we'll be celebrating this in a couple weeks, and we'll also be looking at a parable today that has to do with that week. A little context for that week. Starts on Sunday. Sunday is Palm Sunday, or we call it Palm Sunday, but it was the triumphal entry when Jesus rides in. People are celebrating, they're shaking palm branches. It's a big day, and it's an exciting day, people welcoming him in. Then on Monday, things take a turn for the worse. And Jesus finds himself in the temple, and he is frustrated because he walks into the temple, and what he sees is that the leaders of the Jewish faith are not treating the temple in the way that God intended for the temple to be treated. They're treating it as a house of worship. He says they're treating it like a shopping mall. They're just trying to make money, they're trying to make deals, they're trying to do everything other than, it seems like, worship God. So Jesus gets frustrated, there's this whole interchange that happens. Jesus throws tables around and gets mad. And it's a tough day. Tuesday, Jesus finds himself again in the temple, and he's arguing with these Jewish leaders. And they're the kind of people who are supposed to be the examples, the teachers, the people who all of the Jewish people learn from. And Jesus is saying, you're not acting like a teacher. You're not acting like an example. You're not showing what true faith and love for God is supposed to be like. So Jesus has all these debates and these arguments with these Jewish leaders in the temple. After that happens on Tuesday at some point, Jesus leaves Jerusalem. And he walks away only with his disciples. So nobody else is following him, it seems like. It's just his disciples. And they take a walk. And they walk away from Jerusalem, and they walk a ways up a hill. And it's a couple miles away, probably, it doesn't take very long, that they walk a ways up to the Mount of Olives. And from the Mount of Olives, then, he has these conversations with his disciples about all this stuff that's happened and these tough days that have gone on, and they start talking about all these bigger and bigger and deeper things. They start talking about the day of the Lord, and they start talking about the future, and when is God going to come back? And Jesus, where are you going? Because you're talking about all these mysterious things of leaving and going to the Father. You know, the disciples' heads are spinning, and Jesus is saying these things, and they're feeling the weight of what's going on. Like something big is about to happen. Something serious is going on, and it's all about the future, and it seems like it might happen right now, or it might happen tomorrow, or it might happen next year. We don't know. And they're asking Jesus about this, and Jesus is throwing it all out there. He's getting intense, and he's trying to tell the disciples, this is it. If you're going to be anybody, be this kind of person. If you're going to love God, love him this way. I mean, he's talking about all these big, future, faith-building kinds of things. And in the middle of this whole discussion, what does Jesus do? He tells a story. An epic story, like the ones we've been looking at. He tells a story to get across to the disciples what it is that he wants them to truly understand. And as he introduces this story that we're going to look at, the story that the kids read, it's a story that has to do, Jesus introduces it as the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom is another one of these stories where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And again, that's just talk for this is how God's plans in the future are going to unfold. And this is what they're going to look like. And I'm giving you a story to help you glimpse what they're going to look like. So in that frame of mind, he's talking about the future. He's talking about what God's plans are looking like. Then this is the story Jesus tells. Let's refresh our memory a little bit. It's in your bulletin, or you can follow along on the screen. Then the kingdom of heaven will be compared to 10 bridesmaids. Their story said virgins, we call them bridesmaids. Bridesmaids, just a little easier for us to get. 10 bridesmaids, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish took their lamps, but they took no oil with them. The wise took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Then at midnight there was a shout, "Behold, the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" Then all the bridesmaids rose, prepared their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, "No, there will not be enough for us and you too. Go instead to the stores and buy some for yourselves." And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast. And the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids also came, saying, "Lord, Lord, open up for us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you." And then Jesus speaks at the end of the story, "Keep watch, for you do not know the day nor the hour." So the story's all about bridesmaids. It's about these 10 bridesmaids who get invited. Now, bridesmaids then were not like bridesmaids now. They didn't have matching dresses, and they didn't stand up in front supporting the bride at the wedding ceremony. It was a totally different world. And in simple terms, they were simply people who attended the bride at the wedding. Whatever that meant, whatever that looked like, that was their job. They attended. So they were invited in some way or another, and we don't know all the details, they were invited to be part of this wedding parade, or this processional that was happening. All we know is the bridegroom was going from here to here, and there was evidently a feast that was happening. And as this parade was happening, people would join in. And it was commonly done. They did these parades all the time. People would join in the parade, and if it was light outside, everybody could see. If it was dark outside, they'd grab their torch or their lamp and they'd carry it with them. So these 10 bridesmaids were invited at some point to station themselves along this parade route and to join in this parade that was happening. And this is celebration, and you've got to be ready for this. And so these 10 bridesmaids come. And we learn the difference between the two groups. One is foolish and one is wise. But it's fascinating what's similar about the groups of bridesmaids. They all got invited. They all went to the same place to wait. They all fell asleep. They all woke up when it was announced that the bridegroom was coming. They all prepared their lamps and they brought their lamps with them. The only thing that was different is what? Oil. They didn't bring their oil. Now the way their torches worked, they were kind of like this. They were a little stick with a little bowl on the end and a little wick inside. And what they would do is, when they transported this somewhere, they couldn't fill it with oil. Because what would happen? It'd spill right out. But they would bring oil in a bottle or a flask so that then they could fill it when they were ready, light it, hold it up, and join the parade. And when the oil went out, they would refill it with their flask of oil. And they'd hold it up, and they'd join the parade. So they didn't come with it pre-filled. You couldn't prepare in advance. You had to bring your oil with you, fill it, light it, and let it go. So when these bridesmaids, these foolish ones, say, "Our lamps are going out," they probably had a little bit of oil still in their wick from the last time they used it. They light it, it would stay lit for a minute or two, and then it goes out. And they need oil to refill. And the one difference is they didn't bring oil. One difference that made such an incredible impact in this story. And that's the only difference. So, then they move on to the wedding feast. The wise bridesmaids get into the wedding feast. The foolish bridesmaids do not get into the wedding feast. And it's all because they weren't ready. They weren't prepared. They didn't have their oil. And at the end, Jesus says, The bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast. And this is just why Jesus tells the story. When it comes to God's plans, which he's talking to the disciples about, when it comes to the kingdom of heaven, when it comes to the future, when it comes to what God is doing, Jesus calls us to simply be ready. And really, this is an ingenious story, because if you put all these things together, these things that we've observed, it's fascinating what comes out of this. I mean, Jesus had a tough week, and he was talking to all these people about these weighty, big issues of the future. Jesus is now only talking with his disciples, and he's passionate about them being ready. He'd also just been talking about with all these Jewish leaders about them seeming to look ready, but they weren't really ready. And he was criticizing them because they weren't truly ready, but everybody thought they were ready. You know, they looked on the outside like all these 10 things were right on, but there's one thing about them that wasn't quite right. One simple thing that can have a huge impact. So when it comes to the kingdom of heaven, everyone gets invited to the feast, everyone is welcomed, everyone has an invitation. But many people who look ready do not get to go to the feast. It's only the people who are truly ready. Ready, Jesus says. Be ready. We must be ready. And I gotta think, ready for what? I mean, what is it that Jesus is saying? All of this passionate, driven, I'm going to tell you a story about it. It's so important. Be ready for what? Because we're not all invited to a wedding. Ready for what? I think what he's saying is be ready for God to move. Because God moves all the time. God does big things. God moves everywhere all the time. God answers prayers. God changes the world. God transforms people. God shows up. God moves all the time. And God is able to manage all kinds of things. God is always moving. And God is going to move whether we're ready for God to move or not. I mean, God wants us to be involved in the things God is doing, but if we are not ready, we miss out. And Jesus, if anything, is saying, don't miss out on the things that God is doing and the moves that God is about to make. Because if you miss them, you know what happens? If we miss God moving, we don't get moved. But when we see God moving, that's when we get moved. We're moved by God moving. When we were initially talking about RiverCross Church, I, for one, was not convinced that God was moving us to start a church. I had hardly ever thought about starting a church. It was not in my family's experience. It was not in my experience. It was not in the experience of the people who I learned from and trained from and did anything with, really. It was not part of my life. And so when Kimberly and I would dream about our future and what would happen someday, starting a church was not in our dreams. So when we started talking about this idea all together, we decided, well, let's pray. And as I've said before, our prayer was, God, if you're calling us to start a church, then tell us to start a church. If you're not calling us to start a church, then tell us not to start a church. Because we don't have to do this. I mean, it's not in our plan, and it's okay. We can do other things, but it doesn't have to be this. So just let us know, one way or another. And so we basically prayed for God to move. And I expected that God's answer to the prayer would be, like a sense of confirmation, or a feeling of, yeah, let's do this, or no, let's not, or like write me a letter and just have it say, start a church, or don't you dare start a church. I mean, that's what I thought God would do, one of those kinds of things. And that's not what happened. What happened is that God started to plant a vision. And it was a vision for a people and a location and groups and neighborhoods of people that don't have access to a church and maybe don't even know Jesus. And when that vision happened, we started realizing all together that, oh my goodness, this vision is there. And we realized that God is actually doing something, and we didn't expect it to happen this way. And when we sat back and got excited and passionate about the vision, and then when more people got passionate about the vision, we realized God just moved. I didn't see it coming. And when God moved, we got moved. And we got moved here. When God moves us. So what does it to move. What does it take? Jesus' story suggests that, at least for the bridesmaids, and for us, that there is something specific that we can do to be ready. It's not like just this amorphous or clueless, be ready. No, there's specific things. For them, it was take oil. If you take oil, then that's the signal that you're ready. And for us, I got to ask, well, what's the signal that we're ready for God to move? How do you know when you're ready? How do we know when we're ready for God to move? The same advice seems to come from almost every coach of every major sport when they're coaching players how to do what the sport calls them to do. For example, tennis. When people are instructing players how to play tennis, they always tell them to watch the ball all the way until it hits the string of the racket before you look anywhere else. Because if you look anywhere else, you're not going to make a good hit. People in football, especially for the receivers, a coach to a receiver would say, you can't think about turning and running until you catch the ball. So watch the ball all the way until it comes here, and then you can think about turning and running. Or about baseball. A hitting coach will always say, keep your eye on the ball, and you can't hit what you can't see. So watch the ball all the way until it comes in, swing, and then you can look out. But keep your eye on the ball. And at the end of Jesus' story, he says, keep watch. And this is exactly what the book of Hebrews says at this kind of culmination, mountaintop moment in the book. I think it captures this whole idea when it says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us set aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured much hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. And right in the middle of that passage is the phrase, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Keep watch. Keep your eye on the ball. Don't take your eyes off the thing that you're trying to work at. Fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. The one indicator that we are ready for God to move is if our eyes are fixed on Jesus. In these months that we've been RiverCross, I think we have spent an unusual amount of time focused on Jesus. And if you think back, if you can remember, in August and September, we spent 2 months looking at people who were amazed by Jesus. We looked at all these different stories of disciples and others and people who were amazed by Jesus. They came away amazed. Then in December, right around Christmas time, we looked at all of these different ways that Jesus came here and now. Jesus brought faith here and now. Jesus brought God here and now. We all looked at all these Jesus things. Then for the last 2 months, we've been looking at all these epic stories that Jesus told. We've only been here 6 months, and we've looked for like 4 months at the life of Jesus and the things that Jesus has done. And some would say, that's not quite right, because there's like 62 other books in the Bible that you could be looking at, but you're only looking at these 4. So why is that? Well, there's a reason. Because if you look at the whole history of the church for several thousand years, what's happened at every major movement of God in the history of the church is those major movements of God have been preceded by groups of people specifically focused on the teachings of Jesus. I don't want us to miss what God is doing and what God is about to do. And if the teachings of Jesus and the wisdom of Jesus can help us see it and be ready, then that's what I want to be focused on. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. And that can happen in so many ways. I mean, we can read about Jesus, we can study Jesus, we can talk about Jesus, we can serve like Jesus. We can ask Jesus, how are you involved in my life and how do you affect my relationships and my situations? We can plead with Jesus, we can act like Jesus, we can do all kinds of things like Jesus. However it looks, may we fix our eyes on Jesus together so that we can be ready. Because we don't know when God is going to move. We don't know where God is going to move. We don't know how God's going to move. Our job is simply to be ready and to have our eyes fixed on Jesus. Let's pray for that.